Chapter 9, Section 3, Solving Quadratic Equations. Quadratic equation. A quadratic equation is an equation that can be written in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, where a does not equal 0. This form is called standard form of a quadratic equation. Today we're going to talk about how to solve equations in the form of x squared equals k. A quadratic equation is going to have 2, 1, or no real solutions. In this lesson and in Algebra 1, we're going to talk about real solutions. Once you get into higher level math classes, I believe starting in Algebra 2, you start talking about things like imaginary numbers, which we're not going to get into in this lesson. This is just basic solving quadratic equations. These first examples says, what are the solutions of each equation? So just like when we're solving any other equation, our goal here is to solve for x or get x, isolate x, our variable, on one side and get it equal to a number. So if you look at example A, it says x squared minus 16 equals 0. My first step to get x by itself would be to add 16 to both sides using inverse operations, which would leave me with x squared equals 16. We've already talked about in class and before in previous lessons that the opposite or inverse of squaring something is to take the square root. So because I have x squared equals 16, when I want to solve for x, I need to take the square root of both sides. Now, something that might be a little bit new in this lesson would be that previously when we've been talking about taking the square roots and things like that, we've been talking about the Pythagorean theorem, which is the length or distance of a side. So we couldn't have negative answers. However, if you think about the square root of 16, if you think about things that multiply times themselves to equal a positive 16, obviously 4, a positive 4 times itself, a positive 4 will give you a positive 16. But then if you think about it, a negative 4 times a negative 4 will also give you a positive 16. So in this case, when we're solving quadratic equations, we're going to have two different answers, and our answer is going to be x equals plus or minus 4, or a positive 4 or a negative 4. Notice the notation that I use there. Instead of writing 4 and then comma negative 4, which you can do, you can also use this notation, which is just an addition sign on top of a negative or subtraction sign, and it just is read plus or minus. So x is going to be positive 4 or it's going to be negative 4. So A would be an example of a quadratic equation with two answers, positive 4 and negative 4. If you look at example B, in parentheses we have x minus 2, close your parentheses, squared, equals 0. In this case, because I'm squaring the binomial x minus 2, what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to take the square root of both sides first to get the binomial x minus 2 outside of my parentheses. So take the square root of both sides. Remember, the square root is the opposite of squaring. So the square root of x minus 2 squared is just going to leave you with x minus 2. And the square root of 0 is 0. So we have x minus 2 equals 0. Now it's a one-step equation. Isolate x or get it by itself by adding 2 to both sides. And when you do that, you get x equals 2. So that would be an example of a quadratic equation that has just one answer. And then if you look at example C, we have x squared plus 10 equals 0. I'm going to go through the same process. I'm trying to isolate my variable x. My first step to do that is to subtract 10 from both sides. When you subtract 10 from both sides, you get x squared equals negative 10. Now, just like in the previous example, in example A, I would need to take the square root of both sides to get x by itself. However, when you start to try to find the square root of negative 10, you're going to come up with what's called an imaginary number. We're not going to get into that right now. what we're going to say right now when we're trying to take the square root of a negative number is that there is going to be no solution. If you think about it, nothing times itself is ever going to give you a negative number. A positive times a positive is always going to be a positive, and a negative times a negative is always going to be a negative. So it doesn't make sense, or you can't take the square root of a negative number and get a real number for an answer. This example says, what are the solutions of 5x squared minus 45 equals 0? Again, my goal is to isolate my variable x. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 45 to both sides first. And I get 5x squared equals 45. Divide both sides by 5. And you get x squared equals 9. Just like in my previous examples, I need to isolate x. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides, which leaves me with x equals plus or minus 3. Or a positive 3 or a negative 3. This last example says the length of a rectangular prism is 3 times the width. The height of the prism is 5 inches. If the volume of the prism is 80 inches cubed, what is the length of the prism? Round to the nearest tenth of an inch. First thing we need to remember is that to find the volume of a rectangular prism, you need to multiply length, width, and height together. So information that they've given me in this problem, first of all, it tells me outright that the height is 5 inches. Then it says the length of a rectangular prism is 3 times the width. So if I make the width of this rectangular prism x, then my length would be 3 times x, or 3 times the width. So now I need to go ahead and use the volume formula, which is just length times width times height. I can set it equal to 80 because it says the volume of the prism is 80 inches cubed. So what I have is I have 5 times x times 3x, which is just height, width, and length. And I set it equal to 80 because they tell me that the volume of the prism is 80 inches cubed. Go ahead and I can multiply 5 times x times 3x. Well, 5 times 3 is 15, and x times x is going to give you x squared. So I have 15x squared equals 80. My goal is to solve for x here. I need to divide by 15 on both sides, and when I do so, I get x squared equals 5.3. Go ahead and take the square root of both sides. In this case, because I am talking about the length of a side of a rectangular prism, a negative answer is not going to make sense because you can't have a negative length or a negative distance. So in this case, yes, technically the square root of 5.3 would have 2 different answers, a positive and a negative answer. However, in this case, and most of the time when you are given a word problem, you have to think about the situation. Would it make sense to have a negative length of a rectangular prism? And the answer would be no, it doesn't make sense because if you had there is no way to have a negative length. You can have no length, but you can't have a negative length. So use your calculator. You could plug in the square root of 5.3, which gives you x equals 2.3 inches. Now, be careful because the question that they're asking me is what is the length of the prism? Well, remember x is the width, so in order to find the length, I need to take 2.3 and I need to plug it into the length, which we said was 3x. So if x is 2.3, then I need to do 3 times 2.3, which gives you the length of 6.9 inches.